Good evening and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And if you follow the news at all lately, you probably know that homelessness is one of the big crises we face in modern America. If you read the news, you know mainly in big population centers in California it's a major problem, but even here in Chicago, we have our issues with homelessness. And so our guest tonight is the Reverend Doug Bradshaw, who is here to talk about Facing Forward, an organization that helps to work with the homeless here in Chicago and get them situated on a new path. So Doug, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Kevin. I appreciate it. I always enjoy an opportunity to talk about Facing Forward.
So let's talk a little bit about, first of all, let's talk a little bit about the problem we face, homelessness. I know just in looking at your website, the number of homeless in Chicago probably exceeds 90,000. That's a lot. And I think people don't have any, or at least I myself would have no concept of that. I mean, I see the homeless when I'm downtown, but it's a few, one or two here and there, and you don't get the sense for the scale of the problem. So how bad is it?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty reasonable number. The latest number I saw was something around 86,000.
Mm-hmm.
And that number is measured a little differently by different groups. HUD looks at people that are just literally on the streets or sleeping in shelters. But the Department of Education, for instance, is looking at people that are homeless but not necessarily on the streets. So there might be a family that's got school-age kids, but they're sleeping in their car or they're couch surfing. And so they're unstably housed, or they're sleeping in places that aren't meant for human habitation. And yeah, all told, that number's around 86,000 people experiencing homelessness today in Chicago. And,
and I think it's important that what you just mentioned, it's not just people on the streets. That if you're couch surfing or you're living in a garage or you're living in your car, you're homeless.
right.
Even if you've got theoretically some space, it's not what we would consider adequate housing. Right?
Yeah, you think about it in the terms of the children. If you're a school-age kid, and you go to school and you get breakfast at school, and after school, where do you go? Mom may still be at work, but you don't have your own place to be, and it might be quite late in the evening before you can get back to that place where you might be borrowing a couch for a while. So that instability is really difficult on the children, disrupts their education, and creates a context that's really ripe for trauma and long-term problems.
And I would think even those, like if you're staying, those who have a couch, if they're at a friend or a relative, it creates great tension because I would imagine they're generally staying in places that are too small for the number of people that are in them. If you're crammed into the living room of a friend's place and you and your 2 or 3 children or whatever the case may be, that creates additional tension. So even when you're in this space that's not on the street, it's not comfortable. It's not where you need to be to lead a normal life, right?
Right. And beyond comfort, the real concerns for people in those circumstances are safety. When, unfortunately, in our world, there are too many vulnerable people and too many people who can and will take advantage of vulnerable people. And you're in a context like that, you often have your kids sometimes in places that maybe you wouldn't like to have them. Unfortunately, the stories that I hear from people on the streets and from our residents too often involve stories of abuse because they were not in a residence that was really meant for them. And I think about a family that is in our program still. They weren't literally homeless by HUD standards because they weren't in a shelter and they weren't found on the streets, but they were living in a storage unit. They spent the winter in a storage unit and they fled a domestic violence situation. That's a homeless family, an unstable family, a family at risk, but not being counted as homeless by HUD, but by Department of Education, yes.
So there are a number of organizations in Chicago that address this problem from various angles. The Coalition for the Homeless. Previously on this show I've had on people about Chicago Hopes for Kids, which helps the homeless students. And so I wonder sometimes is there any kind of coordinating body that looks at all these particular services that address homelessness, for example, or any social ill, but in this case, homelessness, to try to bring some level of coordination amongst these various groups that are all doing good work, but may or may not be aware of each other's services?
Yeah, so in Chicago, in any region really, if you're receiving any kind of HUD money,
Hmm.
and HUD funds housing issues of all different kinds all over the country. So if you're here in Chicago and you're receiving any kind of HUD funding,
But that's the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD,
yes,
right?
yeah,
For those
thank
who
you.
may not know.
To receive that funding, you have to be part of this body called a continuum of care. And it's a membership body, and in Chicago right now, that last I checked, there was about 90 agencies doing something related to homelessness who were members of this continuum of care. And we work collaboratively across all different types of housing solutions, all different types of services, all working collectively to try to end homelessness in Chicago.
And is that a continuity of care? That's a nonprofit itself, or is it a government organization?
The continuum of care is really it's a membership body, right? And so there's an organization called All Chicago that has been tasked by HUD to manage that continuum. All Chicago is its own not-for-profit, and they manage the continuum of care activities, but it's a membership body.
Okay. Yeah. So let's talk about Facing Forward. I mean, you're the executive director of Facing Forward. So, what is the mission of Facing Forward, as I've read it, is housing first, to get people into stable housing. And why have you adopted that particular model?
Yeah, housing readiness was the old idea, and there are a variety of responses to homelessness, and they're all important and they all have a place. Housing first is unique in that it's a solution, and it's a long-term solution. People used to think that you had to go through some kind of process to become ready to be stably housed, to be able to manage an apartment, to be able to handle your rent, to be able to handle paying bills and these sort of things. And what we've discovered is that just creates a high level of recidivism, that short-term shelters or even sometimes transitional housing programs are just not enough to help many of the homeless get stably housed or remain that way long-term. So Housing First says we start there. Instead of trying to get somebody ready to be housed, we use housing as the stable platform to help somebody rebuild and reclaim their life. It's financially really efficient. In our organization, our all-in costs for a single person in housing is about $9,000 a year. Our all-in cost for a family might run $14,000 a year. And that's the light bill, the rent subsidy, the services, the whole thing. Shelter costs are much higher than that. Obviously, the cost to the healthcare system for a family that's homeless tends to run much, much higher than that. So it's a very financially efficient model, and it's highly effective.
So when you say, these numbers, like $9,000 a year, does that include rent and food? And I mean, that's the cost of actually housing an individual person for a year under your program.
Right.
Yeah, that doesn't seem like a lot of money.
Yeah, it's a lot less than you would think. The differentiator in the program is the timeline. The program we run in Housing First is called Permanent Supportive Housing. It's not permanent unless it needs to be. What it really is, it's a housing program without a predetermined end date.
Oh, okay.
So we might work with a family for 5 years or 6 years. So while we're spending $14,000 a year to provide housing and support services for that family, and that's the majority of our population is moms with kids.
Yeah.
We'll do that for 5, 6, 7 years, as long as it takes for them to exit from the program into long-term stable housing so that they never enter homelessness again.
So how do you determine that? How do you know when someone's ready to graduate?
Yeah, that's a collaborative conversation between our case management team and the individual or the family. Sometimes somebody gets stable and they deal with some of the issues that cause their homelessness, whether it's mental health issues or just simply job loss or sobriety, or they deal with those issues and they get really excited and they're just like, man, I'm ready to go. But they may not have the stable income that they need yet. They may not have the financial reserves that they need yet, the community networks and stability that they need to not end up back in the system. So our case management team might step in and say, well, let's evaluate your circumstances. We talk to people about building self-sufficiency, and there's a whole variety of things that we work on to help people do that, whether it's education, job skills, employment, family networks, rebuilding family ties. And so then collectively, when both parties really recognize that the readiness is there, we help them in transition, and we stay with them for at least a year after the exit to help make sure they've remained stably housed. And if they need services through that period, we continue to provide whatever they need.
Well, I think that, and clearly the program works because you do it. But the thing I would wonder about, or I do wonder about, is particularly in case of, say, mental illness, where someone has become homeless because of a substantial case of mental illness, some serious debility. How can you guarantee that that can actually be adequately addressed? I mean, how would you work with that? Say, an individual in particular, maybe even someone who doesn't have kids, but who might be severely troubled. How do you get them into the right program? How do you make sure that they can actually be brought to a point where they're self-sustainable?
Yeah, well, there's never a guarantee, and that's the beauty in this permanent supportive housing program, because there are folks that will need us for life. They just simply will never gain the level of self-sufficiency required to move on from our program.
But they can get that from you for this indefinite period.
They can. In our population, Facing Forward really specializes in what's called chronically homeless, so people have been homeless for an extended period of time, and in that group, most vulnerable. And that typically is one of two things. It's typically an older female. Lifespan of a homeless person in Chicago is about 56 years. Homelessness is just tough on people, tough on their health. And so we tend to have a high number of single females coming into the program that are in their late 40s and 50s because they qualify into that most vulnerable space. Or we get young females with children, and because of this children that are young, they also qualify in this most vulnerable space. Inside of that group, we'll see any kind of mental health condition or issue that you can imagine. Sometimes people are completely removed from the homeless services system because of their mental health issues. One resident in our program, she was living in the woods beside a tire shop, and an outreach worker would stop there every day for a year before there was enough trust built for her to put her information in our coordinated entry system so that she could be identified and then housed. And it took us some time to finally house her. Once housed, we can connect her to the right kind of mental health care, right kind of medical care, the right kind of medication. And early on, it's impossible to tell what those outcomes might be. But if she needs us for life, she can be there for life. If she comes to a place where she's ready to exit, we'll help her do that.
So how is your organization funded? Because with this open-ended commitment, I would think it would be hard to determine how much money you're going to need in any given cycle.
Yeah, organizations like ours, and certainly ours included, do depend heavily on government support. So we're about 82% government funded.
Through HUD?
Through HUD, through the city of Chicago, and through the state of Illinois, all providing different kinds of dollars for different needs inside of the work that we do, whether they're, it's funding just for services so that somebody can have a certain kind of service. We provide doula services for young moms who are pregnant, and all different kinds of services. Whatever somebody might need to gain the stability that they're looking for, we can help provide. And so we'll take in resources from all over. Anytime you receive money from a donor, it creates some kind of boundary around what you can do with it. Rarely, some dollars you get are just completely unrestricted. You can do whatever you think is smart. So when HUD wants to give us money to do something to help end homelessness, we're happy to use it. But we're also out there, the other 18% of our funding is private funding that allows us to initiate new programs, innovate, and add capacity to the organization.
Yeah, I would think with, particularly with any government funding, it's, having worked with grants myself, there's a grant to say, I want money to do this. And then later you have to report on how this is doing, and how has that money been spent, and have you been able to achieve the objectives of whatever this is. And so in that respect, that money is, I would imagine it's not all that readily available for innovation, that it's for proven programs, right?
Correct. Correct. Innovation money usually will come from a private funder that you have an opportunity to pitch a special program to, and you find a few partners and they want to get involved. And then once it becomes something of greater interest and there is more of a proven nature to it, you might see government funding get involved at that point.
Well, speaking of that, how did the model that you follow get proven? I mean, at some point this model was innovative, right?
Right. Yeah, in the
So-
early 90s, and I actually don't know exactly the answer to that question, but I do know this idea really came about in the early 90s, and it was ridiculed. People thought it was a terrible idea just to take somebody who's maybe has an addiction and who's living on the streets and just put them in an apartment and expect that to work. But once you apply the quality social services to the process, we really discovered that it is a real best case scenario. And it's continuing to be adopted and deployed all over the country. But certainly here in Chicago, Facing Forward was one of the early adopters of the model and one of the pioneers of helping it become something that Chicago is deeply committed to.
Now, I think this is less true in Chicago, but I read about San Francisco, where I lived at one time.
Yeah.
And as you probably know, the homelessness problem there has mushroomed of late. But it seems to be primarily caused, or the recent causes seem to be economic, that rents have gotten sky high. Housing to be purchased, a 2-bedroom apartment costs $1 million. How does Facing Forward cope with that kind of issue, where it's not, in those cases, it's not the fault of the person who's homeless. They may be working as a teacher or a teacher's aide and not making a lot of money, and the rent just quadrupled, so they're out on the street. How are those situations handled?
Yeah, thank you. That's an important question. Certainly, the -- 1 cause of homelessness is affordable housing. The lack of affordable housing. It's a major issue here in Chicago. 30%, I think, rent or occupied, and very, very few families actually make enough to be able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment in our city. It's very, very expensive, and it's an issue, as we're seeing on the coasts, but really all over the country. Facing Forward right now is working on a program. Other organizations are too, but there's an effort to try to address things more on the front end. Try to close the entryway into homelessness and catch people before they enter into the homeless service system. It's called diversion programming. We have some funders who've gotten interested in helping us do some diversion programming. We're working really hard to identify through a variety of partnerships, including partnerships with schools, those families that are highly at risk, that are doubled up and tripled up, and to capture them and to help navigate them toward long-term stable housing solutions before they ever enter the homeless system. We think in the next 5 years, over the last 2, Facing Forward has housed about 160 families through that model, and we anticipate escalation in that, and over the next 5 years, we think we can house about 600 families through that model if we can get the funding to come in that we anticipate.
And is that the total client base for Facing Forward is about 600, well, the projection is 600 families in total?
That's in the navigation program alone,
Okay.
the diversion program
right.
alone. So currently, a point in time, we're housing roughly 700 people. About 45% of those are minor children, and the vast majority, as I said, are single moms with kids.
Yeah.
Over the last 12-month count that we did, we housed 725 people in that time, and then in addition to that, we've got the 160 families. That's a shorter-term engagement. We help them into stable housing, and then we move on and help the next family into stable housing. Those folks that have just don't quite make enough to afford housing on their own, they don't need the long-term services. So we're really working on both ends of the spectrum.
So what it makes me think about is actually several things, but one of them is advocating for housing subsidies, for example. So if you can't build affordable housing, which in some places you can't, again, I go back to San Francisco, it's a peninsula, there's just not that much space to build.
Right.
So if you're faced with this shortage of affordable housing and you can't just go out and build a bunch of new housing, the alternative, it seems to me, would be to have some level of government funding to make up the difference, right? So if I, as a working person, can't afford the rents because they've just tripled in my neighborhood, is that something that, it seems to me that having a government subsidy for that is a reasonable thing to prevent homelessness, because the subsidy is probably cheaper than the health care and the criminal action, whatever else, the other societal costs that come about when homelessness occurs. So is it reasonable to assume that might be a solution, or is that something that Facing Forward actually considers or thinks about?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly reasonable to think that's a solution. And for some, it might be a short-term solution. For some, it might be a long-term solution. But I think it reflects a real intelligent collaboration in the community. And I think there will always be some kind of need for our government, which is here to help create healthy communities, right? It's a big part of what they're meant to do. To help ensure.
In one view of government, yes.
Sure.
Mine,
Well,
but
yeah.
yes, not everyone's.
Yeah, but to intervene in that space and to recognize that the economic investment on the front end pays great dividends on the back end. In Chicago right now, if you're a child who's experienced homelessness, you've only got about a 1 in 4 shot at graduating. In our program, we have people that are specialized in different age and stage groups for the children to help make sure that they maximize their education, help make sure that when they're adults they can launch effectively into college or some kind of legitimate career where they can make a proper income. Those same kids are at risk for ending up homeless like their parents have been. Poverty and homelessness have real generational impact. But when we can disrupt that, those kids, rather than becoming homeless in the future, becoming a drain on the system in the future, become productive citizens. They get good jobs. They become productive members of their community. They pay taxes, and they do a lot of good things downstream. But we really have to intervene as early as we can.
So is your model scalable? I mean, we talk about you have, I think you mentioned 700 some families or individuals, but there are 86,000 who are homeless. Now, not all of those would necessarily qualify for your program, but 700, as wonderful as that is a drop in the bucket in a sea of 86,000. So if you had unlimited funds, if the government suddenly came in and said, hey, we'll write you a check, let's go make this happen. Is your program something that could be done citywide? Could you theoretically at some point address every person who's got this homeless need, everyone, or at least everyone in your critical need categories?
Yeah, the only limiting factors are available housing and funding. I think it'd be fair to say too that, like in a lot of sectors, finding quality people to do the work really matters. Facing Forward makes a great effort to ensure that we're hiring people with good experience, good strong backgrounds, and are high quality, and our outcomes show that quality. And when I talk to friends and I talk to people on our board of directors and other people in the business community, they're all facing a real challenge in trying to draw talented people. So that's a limiting factor too. We have to make sure that these universities have quality programs for people entering into the social service spaces and good social work programs.
Because I'm sure it doesn't pay as much as tech or banking, right?
It just doesn't, and that's a challenge. But the people who do end up in that space end up there for really great reasons because they're passionate about it and they're dedicated to it. So I don't think there's any reason that we couldn't continue to scale this program to whatever size it needs to be if the resources were available. But in addition, because there are different kinds, people experience homelessness in different ways and have different kinds of needs, and there are really kind of 4 responses, and I think they all have a great place. The diversion type programming that we're growing into right now.
Catch them before they hit it.
Yep,
right.
On the front end, these people are still highly vulnerable. Many are still homeless, but they really haven't hit the system yet.
Yeah.
But then there is a need for like domestic violence shelters and crisis shelter. You're in a really bad spot. You need a place to go that's safe and secure overnight while you get connected to something.
And you need it like right now, today.
Yeah. And you know, you can't wait because you and your little kids don't need to be hiding out in the bushes or sleeping under a bridge somewhere. And then there's shorter term housing solutions, transitional 1.5 to 2-year housing solutions where people can come in, get stable. Their needs are significantly less than those in our chronic population. So those types of programs are also highly valuable and important. And so if I were given the big check, I would make sure that we're doing all 4 of those things incredibly well. One of the real challenges is making sure people end up in the right spot.
And which one of those 4 categories
That's right.
in?
And unfortunately, one of the challenges we face is if you've experienced homelessness and you get put into this particular slot, you can lose your designation as a homeless person or as somebody who's experiencing homelessness. And you might actually need this slot. And so it's very difficult to transition you from here over to here once we realize what your needs really are, because the designations that you have changed.
Does that affect funding? Like if you're designated as something, you're eligible for some HUD funds and
Yeah.
not in another designation,
Yes.
right?
So in some programs, somebody would enter the program and they would no longer be called homeless. And then they would lose the timeline required to enter into my program around chronically homeless. Even though their mental health needs might be so severe that they really need to be with us, it's a hard time. We have a hard time getting them there because they ended up in the wrong bucket in the first place.
So let me segue a little bit to, you mentioned finding quality people. How do you find them? How do you find people who have the skills and the tenacity and the dedication to be able to do this?
Well, we have partnerships with some of the universities in the area, and we make sure that we are always part of the solution. So we have right now we have typically three. I think we have three right now interns. So I think we have 2 masters in social work interns and 1 bachelor in social work intern. So we're always trying to give back, and that also puts us in contact with those education communities. So we have a real close connection to the pipeline. In addition, 2 of my top staff teach in some of those environments.
Okay.
So that helps a lot. And then, there's always, inside of the system, there's always movement,
Oh, I'm sure. But I'm curious, how do you screen for people, especially people coming out of college who have a vision of what this is and may have the right motivation, but may not understand, here's what the job really entails.
Right.
How do you work with that? How do you screen to find the people who really can do it?
We really work hard in the interview process. One, to make sure that people do understand. We do have to hire some entry-level folks, but we typically, more often than not, we hire people with prior experience because of the direct contact and because of the difficult neighborhoods in which we work and the difficult populations that we serve. We also don't expect anybody to be the whole solution. Every family is different, and so we hire for a multidisciplinary team. So every family has a dedicated case manager, but they also have a multidisciplinary team that's connected to that family. And that family will have dedicated case managers for the children. If you have a kid that's in grade school, they're going to have a very specific case manager that's connected just for the grade school process. If you've got children younger than that, we have a team for that. If you're older than that in your teen years and getting ready to launch, we have a team for that. And so we really work collaboratively together to be able to address people's needs effectively.
So we've got about 30 seconds left. So what would you want people who have watched the show, what's the one message you want them to take away from the show?
Yeah, I think there are 2 things I'd want to say, and the first one is that what drew me to Facing Forward and the model that they use is that it's a solution. Band-Aids are really important, but they're not the answer to a lot of problems. And what Facing Forward is doing creates a real long-term solution. People literally get to end their homelessness
So
forever.
you got 10 seconds for the second point.
And the second one is the way we help people involves making sure that they take responsibility for their own lives. When we take that away from people, we harm them. So we want to make sure that our process is giving them the control of their life back.
Doug, I couldn't ask you to sum it up any better. Thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure. And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19, or see us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So thank you to Doug Bradshaw, and we'll see you again next week. So till then, thank you and good night.